So we're just going to do a brief review on web programming, and then we're going to talk about how the MVC pattern fits into the web programming picture. So the big picture with web programming is basically you have users that make requests. The request is sent to some type of web server. The server processes the request and sends a response back to the user. So that's kind of how it works. There's a variety of components that users will use to make their requests. They might use a computer, a smartphone, a tablet, and there are a variety of web servers. The internet itself is part of a wide area network. It basically connects local area networks to the wide area network. So local area network is computers connected in a limited geographic range, and the wide area network is taking advantage of our different communication channels. So it may use satellite, may use fiber optics, but the computers that it connects are not close together. An ISP is basically an internet service provider that basically is part of that wide area network, and they can give you access to the wide area network that is the internet. So that's kind of how it works in a nutshell. And as far as a web page goes, there are several components in a web address, and a web address is also called a URL, Uniform Resource Locator. So there are actually four primary parts to a URL. The first part that you're going to see, which is the part with the colon at the end, that is called the application protocol, or sometimes it's just called a protocol. But it basically tells the browser what type of page is being retrieved so the browser can render it properly. Most of the time you are going to see HTTP or HTTPS because that is used for web pages. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and the S at the end just means it's secure. And nowadays, pretty much all of them end in S. So most of the sites you encounter are going to have HTTPS. Other sites that you may encounter would be FTP sites. There aren't that many of them, but they start with FTP : The application protocol is one of three protocols that are used to display web pages. The other two, I'm sure you are familiar with. They are IP and TCP. Quite often they are used together, so you'll see them as TCP/IP. And basically, they are responsible for transmitting the page and making sure that it arrives at its destination intact and accurate. So basically, if you wanted to retrieve a Mickey Mouse page from Walt Disney World, TCP IP makes sure that you get the page you asked for, okay, that it arrives and that it's accurate. After the application protocol, you will see the domain name. The domain name is basically the name of the computer that is storing the page. Domain names have numeric equivalents to the text name that you typically see. And you can use numbers or text for the domain name. People tend to use text because it's easier to remember than a sequence of numbers. After the domain, you have what's called a path. And all a path is it's a folder or folders that are on the computer that is storing the web page. So it's kind of your file structure. Then after the path, you have the file name itself. Okay, so kind of breaking this down, you've got the protocol that's telling the browser what type of page it is so the browser can render it or display it properly. Then you've got the name of the computer that is storing the page. Then you've got any folders that the page is located in. And finally, you have the file name. So this isn't that different than how you store things on your own computer at home, right? You have a C drive, you have all of your folders, and then you've got your files. Okay, so it's kind of the same concept, it's just on the web. Web pages themselves can be static or dynamic. Static pages are by far the easiest to create because they have content that doesn't change. Okay, so the user doesn't have to make any selections or input anything, it just displays. So the client makes the request, the web server serves the files, done, okay? Dynamic pages typically involve content that changes based on what the user selects. Quite often, the dynamic page will retrieve data that is stored. It may be stored in a database, but it could also be stored in a JSON file or an XML file. ASP.NET Core apps have different types of servers. And it just depends on the environment that you are working in. ASP.NET Core is an application server. Kestrel is a cross-platform web server. And MS SQL Server is the database management system that would be running on a database server. Now, before .NET Core, ASP.NET used IIS, Internet Information Services. And the disadvantage of IIS is that our pages, our MVC pages that we created with ASP.NET had to run on a Microsoft server. They were not cross-platform. So the advantage of using ASP.NET Core is that you now have this cross-platform ability. So you can run your applications on a Linux or a Unix-based web server. So that is a huge advantage to using .NET Core. So how a web server processes a dynamic web page, it kind of depends on what the page is doing, but assuming that it is retrieving data, the client makes the request will come into the web server, and in a .NET Core environment, the web server is Kestrel. And then that request is sent on to the application server, which is ASP.NET Core. And then ASP.NET Core interacts with the MS SQL server. Okay, so it executes the commands, retrieves the data. Once ASP.NET Core has the data, it sends it back to the web server, which in turn sends it back to the client. Okay, so that's kind of how this whole process works.